During World War II, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to live in government internment camps. Japanese were interrogated and under heavy suspicion and lived in the camps for several years. But what led to the internment camps in the first place, and what is the significance of Pearl Harbor and their creation? On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan led a devastating attack against the U.S. naval base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, killing 2,402 Americans and injuring 1,282. This event directly led to the entrance of the U.S. into World War II and by extension even later use of atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With pre-Pearl Harbor anti-Japanese sentiment already in place, and the attack on Pearl Harbor bringing even greater distrust, a significant event loomed in the future. Now in a state of wartime, on February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which allowed the Secretary of War to prescribe military areas and may determine from which any or all persons may be excluded. Alongside Executive Order 9066 also came a list called the ABC list, which contains categories to the degree of suspicion Japanese were placed. The categories were A through Z, starting from people who were A, known dangers, to C, people who demonstrated pro-Japanese inclinations. Within hours of the attack at Pearl Harbor, arrests on the ABC list began. Thousands of Japanese along the west coast were subject to removal by Order 9066. The attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, alongside Executive Order 9066, led to the internment camps and the internment of 120,000 Japanese living in the United States at the time.
During World War II, there were 5 different types of internment camps. The 5 internment camps were the Assembly Center. The Assembly Center was where all the Japanese came together for particular purposes. Next was the Relocation Center, which was a center where they were sent to live while being away from their homes during their investigation. The next one was Isolation Center. That was for Japanese American prisoners who were seen as troublemakers during the camps, and the Justice Department Army or other facilities. These 5 camps were for over 110,000 people of Japanese heritage.
How was the camp after the internees arrived? In Fort Missoula, the Italians arrived in May 1941. After Pearl Harbor, they couldn't go back to Italy, so the 1,200 Italian soldiers were kept in Fort Missoula. To the Italians, staying here was better than it would be staying in Italy because they got taken care of, all the luxury and good meals every day. The camp was very isolated to what they did, but the guards were actually nice people. So sometimes they would take a couple of the internees off the camp and take them fishing down at the river. On their free time during the day, the Italians would make wooden boats for decorations or gifts for the people. After the war was over, a couple of the Italians stayed here to live their lives. 2 months after the Italians arrived, the Japanese Americans came to Fort Missoula to be relocated, but it was only the men who came to stay. Japanese American women and children came to visit their fathers or relatives that were in the camp. And when these Japanese Americans were relocated, they felt that they were not being trusted by the government, mainly because the Japanese Americans who came to the camp were loyal citizens of the U.S. Life for the Japanese Americans was like the Italians, but they didn't really like it as much as the Italians. Both the Japanese and Italians enjoyed each other's company. They both did things together and taught different things to each other. The Japanese would do plays and have some of the Italian men play a part. They also taught the Japanese judo. Both groups lived happy with each other. Nothing really serious ever happened. No one tried to run away or start any conflict.
My question was, how did the internees make life livable and comfy? What I found out was their life was really boring and sucked for them. because there was nothing they could really do. Some of the internees made sculptures out of rock, and a guard that worked at the camp took some of the internees out to go fishing. The guard even had his own boat he would bring out for them. There were even some Japanese men that would teach others how to do judo. Some even made boats that's pretty much what they had to do. They could go and buy things from the inside of the camp. There was a store that had things in there that they could buy, like their smokes or their food or other supplies that they wanted or needed. They couldn't leave the camp. There were guards on horseback riding around the camp, making sure none of the internees would escape. No prisoners ever tried to escape. There was 1,000 bored Japanese internees at the camp, and of that 1,000, 4 died of probably natural causes.
What was the healthcare like in Fort Missoula during Pearl Harbor? In Missoula, we had an internment camp called Fort Missoula. The government provided a lot of stuff for them, like jobs, foods, beds, and even medical insurance. The medical insurance included dentistry, x-rays, appointments with doctors. According to Farewell to Manzanar by Jeanne Houston and James Houston, many people didn't want to bother with going to the doctors because the doctors already had a lot of patients to care for. The government made sure that everyone in the internment camps would have medical care if needed. They would find Japanese Americans who were doctors and had a medical license and have them take care of the people who needed medical care. Some of the Japanese doctors would even volunteer. There was one doctor named Dr. Smiley. He was very questionable about the work Japanese American doctors did. He said to check with what they were doing because they had erratic and unreliable medication. When Dr. Smiley was doctor, he reported that many Italians had syphilis, but he also said that they were hypochondriacs. He rarely believed that the patients were really sick. This is just one example of how some of the patients were treated with their medical care in the camp. Not all doctors were like this, though. Since some of the doctors were Japanese Americans, they probably treated their patients with respect. These are all examples of how the medical care was in the internment camps during Pearl Harbor.
My research question is, what is the difference between how the Italians were treated and how the Japanese were treated in Fort Missoula? The main difference between the ways the Italians were treated as opposed to the ways Japanese were treated is based on the reason why they were put into Fort Missoula. Italians were World's Fair workers and civilian seamen whose ships had been impounded at the outbreak of the war in Europe. The Japanese, on the other hand, were prominent in their West Coast communities and were considered potentially dangerous. Fort Missoula was like two different camps split between the Japanese and Italians. The Japanese were suspected of being spies, so they had to prove their loyalty, and they had to work and were able to interact with the community, while the Italians got to go out into the community and interact with other people. The Italians were given the option to return to Europe with their crews and ships or accept life in a detention facility. They chose the detention facility, and they were given housing and food until they returned home, while the Japanese were not given an option and were forced into the detention facility life. The Italians were protected by the Geneva Convention and were given the right to leave Fort Missoula, so they could work within cherry fields, railroads, and sugar beet fields. And even though it didn't happen that often, Japanese were also allowed to leave Fort Missoula for fishing and work purposes. But they didn't because they thought working was beneath them. There were 4 dormitories at Fort Missoula that could accommodate 1,000 men. But the Italians' ship officers demanded separate quarters and eating facilities. Accommodations far exceeded the guidelines set down by the Geneva Convention. Camp supplies were purchased from a grocery store in Missoula for the Italians. The main reason the Italians and Japanese were treated differently was based on their circumstances.
How were the Japanese treated at Fort Missoula during the trials? When the men went on trial to the courtroom, they were assigned a translator if they could not speak English. Often the translators would be Korean and speak pretty decent English. The men would get their pictures taken before entering the courtroom, and as far as what happened in the courtroom, not much was released, but we do know that the men were treated pretty fairly during trials. Our guide informed us that no one was ever proven guilty, but later on we read that the men would be released into custody to be heavily watched by an American citizen.
The Japanese Americans would never hope for an early release because they might get something way worse than being released. The councilmen were chosen by a group of people called the Alien Enemy Hearing Boards. We were also told that there may have been torturing in the basement of the courtroom building, but that hasn't been proven yet. The questions that the judge would ask would be very personal about their families, their heritage, and other things, such as if they had land in the United States. They would ask what kind of jobs they had and where they got in the States at. When the men would get out of trial, they would be released back into their lives inside the fences. The men liked it there, though, because it was like a vacation that they would never get to leave.
What were the loyalty hearings like at Fort Missoula? Many of the hearings were held in the second floor courtroom of the main building in Fort Missoula. The fort was a place of ISI Japanese men ranging anywhere from 40 to 7 years old who were stationed at the fort during the time of World War II. There was also Italian boatmen who were stationed at the fort as well. It was taken over by the Department of Immigration and Naturalization, or known as the DIN, in 1941 after the event of Pearl Harbor. Many of the Japanese men were interrogated by the Department of Immigration and Naturalization and Alien Enemy Hearing Boards to prove the ISI men's loyalty to the United States. Mainly questions included, what is your full, true, and correct name? How many departures have you made from Japan? From what port on what vessel on what date did you leave Japan? And did you register in accordance with the provisions of the Alien Registration Act of 1940? And the list goes on. The DIN often hired Korean interpreters for the ISI who were unable to speak English. This was an insult to the ISI as they were not allied with the Koreans. Basically, the DIN was trying to find some way to accuse the ISI men of being spies or find them guilty in any means possible of being disloyal to the United States. No ISI men were ever found guilty in the loyalty hearings, at least in Fort Missoula, meaning they passed the test of being loyal to the United States. There are three options after completing the loyalty hearing: internment for the duration of war, release on parole to return to families, or unconditional release, which would place an ISI man under custody of an American citizen. In total, there were 1,084 enemy alien hearings in